The sun was a hammer in 1872, beating the dust of the frontier into a fine, choking powder. Every soul in this forgotten settlement looked like they were one bad meal away from turning to dust themselves. That's when Eli McGraw, a man who wore his silence like a coat, stepped out of the mercantile with a sack of flour on his shoulder and stopped cold. Two little girls stood in the middle of the road. They weren't much older than 3, barefoot and clinging to each other like they were the only two things holding the world together. Their eyes were huge, too big for their faces, and their hair was matted with sweat and dirt. They looked like tiny ghosts the sun had forgotten to burn away. Eli was a widower. He was 32, but grief had carved another 10 years onto his face. He wasn't a man you'd call soft, but the sight of these two children made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt since he buried his wife. The taller one, brave as a soldier, lifted her chin. Her voice was like a dry twig snapping. "We lost Mama," she said. "She went to find food, and never came back." The words sliced through the thick, hot air. Eli's boots felt like they'd grown roots into the ground. For a second he thought he'd misheard, but their eyes, ancient with a sorrow no child should know, told him it was the God's honest truth. They weren't just lost, they were abandoned. He could see hunger etched into their bones. The dust of the road was caked onto their legs. He slowly, carefully, lowered himself to one knee, the leather of his duster groaning in protest. He just looked at them, taking in the tattered calico of their dresses, the trembling of their tiny hands. His wife had been gone for 3 winters. Since then, his words had become as hard and scarce as water in a drought. His days were a rotation of chores, lonely suppers, and staring into a cold fireplace. He searched for something gentle to say, but the words were gone. They had died with his Mary, so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He acted. He held out his hand, slow and steady. The younger girl flinched, but the older one just stared at his calloused palm. You could see the war in her eyes, suspicion fighting against a desperate, bottomless need. After a long moment, a hand so thin it was barely there crept forward and touched his. He closed his fingers around hers. It was a gentle pressure, the kind of touch a man might use on a newborn foal. No words, no promises, just a silent message that passed from his hand to hers. "You're not alone anymore." He led them over to the water trough. The whole town was watching now. Faces peered out from behind dusty windows. Men stopped their conversations to stare. He heard a familiar, sharp voice cut through the quiet. It was Martha Green, a widow whose tongue was sharper than a skinning knife. "Mark my words," she hissed to her companion, "no good comes from taking in stray mouths." The whisper carried on the hot breeze, but Eli didn't even flinch. He lifted the smaller girl up to the trough and held her steady as she drank, her little body shaking with thirst. Then he took out his kerchief, dipped it in the cool water, and gently washed the grime from their faces. He could feel the town's judgment like a physical weight on his back. But a single thought pushed everything else away. If their mother hadn't come back, she was out there somewhere, lying between desperation and death. Eli knew that kind of silence. He had dug his own wife's grave under a cottonwood tree. He knew what it was to be left behind. He set his sack of flour in his wagon and turned back to the girls. His voice, when it finally came, was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "Where?" he asked. The older girl pointed. Her small finger aimed toward the edge of town, where the prairie rolled out into a sea of sun-scorched grass and collapsing barns. The road was a lonely ribbon stretching out to nowhere. Eli scooped up the smaller girl into his arms, and the other one latched onto his sleeve. He walked, the only sounds being the buzz of grasshoppers and the heavy, silent breathing of the children. They reached the barn she'd pointed to. It was leaning sideways, half surrendered to the elements. Eli pushed the heavy door open. The smell of old hay and rot hit him first, but underneath it there was something else, something sharp and sour, the smell of sickness. And there she was, Against the far wall, a woman lay on a pile of dirty straw. She was so thin she barely made a shape under her ragged dress. Her face was as pale as milk, her hair stuck to her forehead with fever sweat. In one hand, she clutched a basket filled with wilted weeds, a last desperate attempt to find something, anything, for her children. Her eyes were closed. Her breath was a rattling, shallow sound, each one a struggle. Eli froze. The hardness he had built around his heart for 3 long years cracked right open. This woman, this mother, was at the very edge of life. He gently set the little girl down and walked toward her, his boots silent in the dirt. He bent down and slid his arms under her. She was shockingly light, as if starvation had hollowed her out from the inside. She stirred, her lips moving, whispering words that made no sense. Apologies. Prayers. Her shame was heavier than her body. The girls huddled behind him, their small footsteps like the patter of rain. When Eli stepped back out into the blinding sunlight with the woman in his arms, the whole town seemed to turn and stare. He saw Martha Green on her porch, her face a mask of disapproval. "What's he want with her?" Her voice rang out, clear and cruel. "Already lost one wife, now he's carrying home another man's trouble." Eli's jaw tightened. He ignored her. He just kept walking, one deliberate step after another. The weight of the dying woman in his arms was nothing compared to the weight of the town's scorn. His cabin was small, nestled by a stand of cottonwood trees. It smelled of pine, leather, and old smoke. He laid the woman, Clara May, on his own bed. She whispered another apology, her eyelashes fluttering like the wings of a trapped moth. The twins immediately scrambled onto the bed, grabbing their mother's hands as if their touch alone could keep her tethered to this world. Eli didn't say a word. He went about his work. He stoked the fire. He boiled water. He tore a loaf of bread in half and gave it to the girls. They ate like starving animals, their small, desperate bites sending crumbs all over their dresses. He didn't watch them, but he could feel the tension in his shoulders ease just a little as their frantic chewing slowed. Night fell, painting the windows in shades of purple and black. Clara May woke just long enough to sip some water. She whispered her thanks, but every syllable was laced with shame. Eli sat in a chair across the small room, the firelight dancing across the scars on his hands. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the empty rocking chair in the corner. His wife's chair. The silence in the room was thick, but it wasn't angry. It was the silence of a man who had forgotten what a family felt like. Clara May's eyes filled with tears that slid silently down her temples and into her hair. She looked at her sleeping daughters, then at the hard-faced stranger who had pulled her back from the brink of death. "Forgive me, Lord," she whispered, her voice cracking, "for being too weak to feed my own babies." The words hung in the air, raw and fragile. Eli didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he set down his tin cup. He leaned forward and placed his big, work-roughened hand over hers where it lay on the quilt. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The simple weight of his hand said more than any words could. It said shame had no home here. It said that being weak didn't mean you weren't worthy of help. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The twins sighed in their sleep, curled up against their mother like a pair of kittens. Clara May's eyes fluttered closed, a single tear escaping. For the first time in 3 long years, Eli didn't feel the crushing weight of being alone in his cabin, but outside, beyond the circle of firelight, trouble was brewing. The town's gossip was gathering like a storm cloud, and judgment, he knew, could strike faster and harder than any bolt of lightning. The lives of these 3 strangers were now tied to his, and a question started to form in the back of his mind, a question he had no answer for. Had he just saved a family? Or had he just invited his own ruin? The summer dragged on, thick and heavy. Inside Eli's small cabin, a strange new rhythm began to form. The twins, Lily and June, were starting to laugh again, their mouths full of the cornbread their mother, Clara, now cooked over Eli's fire. But Clara herself moved like a ghost. She kept her shoulders hunched, her eyes downcast, as if she was afraid the very air she breathed was a debt she could never repay. Every morning before the sun was up, she was scrubbing the porch, mending his shirts with tiny, perfect stitches, tending the garden. She worked tirelessly, trying to pay for the kindness he had shown her. Every night, Eli would see her lips moving in silent prayer. He knew she was praying for forgiveness, for the sin of being a failure. Eli watched her from a distance. He still didn't speak much. Silence was the language he knew best. But something inside him, something that had been frozen solid for years, was starting to thaw. It happened whenever she'd look up and her eyes would meet his, just for a second, and he'd see a flicker of gratitude that was so deep it almost looked like pain. But the town hadn't forgotten. The town never forgot. Martha Green made sure of that. Her tongue was a weapon, and she used it with skill. "He's a fool," she'd tell the women at the mercantile, her voice dripping with scorn. "That woman is a sickness. She'll drag him down into the dirt right along with her." The whispers followed Clara like a shadow whenever she had to go into town. Women would pull their skirts aside as she passed. Men would suddenly find something interesting to look at on the other side of the street. She tried to ignore it, to keep her head held high, but the humiliation was a fire under her skin. One day, Sheriff Amos Pike, a decent man caught in the middle, pulled Eli aside. "Folks are talking, Eli," he warned, his voice low. "Having a woman under your roof, with no ring, no vows spoken, it ain't right in their eyes. You're a good man. Don't let her tarnish your name." Eli just gave a slow nod, tipped his hat, and walked away. But the sheriff's words settled like a stone in his gut. This wasn't just idle gossip. This was becoming dangerous. He saw the proof that evening. Clara came back from town with the girls, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling. She sat apart from them at supper, barely touching her food. Eli wanted to ask what happened, to offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. They were locked away in that same cold place where he kept his grief, so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He acted. The next morning, Clara found one of her tattered dresses lying on her cot. It had been neatly patched. The stitches were rough and clumsy, clearly a man's work, but they were strong and steady. They were Eli's work. She picked it up and pressed the rough fabric to her face. A quiet, hidden sob escaped her. That night she made sure the choicest piece of rabbit stew was on his plate. It was her way of saying thank you, a silent conversation between two people who had forgotten how to speak. The days passed in this quiet, unspoken language. One evening, Eli came in from the fields and stopped dead in the doorway. Clara was sitting by the fire, braiding June's hair. The lantern light caught the gold in her hair, and her fingers moved with a gentle, loving grace. The sight of it, so simple, so peaceful, hit him like a physical blow. It was the image of a family, the image of a home. For the first time in years, he felt the shape of a word on his lips, a real word. But he bit it back, turned around and walked back outside, breathing in the cool night air to steady himself. Hope was a dangerous thing. The storm finally broke on a Sunday morning. The church bell was ringing, calling the good people of the town to worship. Clara dressed the twins in their patched, clean dresses, her hands shaking. She didn't want to go. She couldn't face the stares, the whispers. But Eli stood by the door, waiting, his gaze steady and unwavering. He didn't ask her to go. He just waited. And his silent expectation gave her a sliver of courage she didn't know she had. They walked into town together. Eli, tall and broad-shouldered. Clara, her head bowed, her shawl pulled tight. The two little girls walked between them, holding their hands. The moment they stepped inside the small church, a wave of whispers rippled through the pews. It was louder than the opening hymn. Eli could feel every eye on them. He saw Martha Green in the front row, her face alight with righteous satisfaction. Sin, scandal. The words were unspoken, but they hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara's face was burning. She wanted to run, to disappear, but then she felt something brush against her hand on the wooden bench. It was Eli's hand, a brief, quiet touch. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a declaration, it was just a simple, grounding presence. It was enough. After the sermon, the congregation lingered outside. It wasn't an accident. They formed a circle, a tribunal of dusty hats and starched bonnets. And then Martha stepped into the center. "It's a disgrace, Eli McGraw," she declared, her voice ringing out for all to hear. "Taking this woman into your home, under your roof, with no vows, no shame. What kind of example is that for our children? You're dragging your own good name through the mud for a stray." Clara's heart shattered. This was it, the ruin she had feared. She pulled her daughters close, tears blurring her vision. "We have to go," she whispered to Eli, tugging on his sleeve. "I won't do this to you. I won't." But Eli didn't move. Instead, he took a step forward. His boots made a loud, deliberate sound on the church steps. His voice, when he spoke, wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a razor. "Enough!" The single word cracked like a whip. Everyone fell silent. All eyes were on him. He reached back and took Clara's hand. He didn't ask. He pulled her gently but firmly to his side to stand before the entire town. The twins clung to his legs. "This woman," he said, his voice low and steady, "is not a stray. Her name is Clara May Whitlock, and from this day forward, she is my wife." The silence that followed was so profound you could have heard a pin drop in the dust. Martha Green's mouth hung open, her eyes wide with shock. Sheriff Pike stared at Eli, a slow, grudging respect dawning on his face. Eli didn't stop there. He looked right at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over their stunned faces. "Her girls," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "are my girls, and I will not hear another word of shame spoken against them. Not in my town." The silence stretched on. Then the Reverend, who had been watching from the church doorway, raised a hand. "Then let it be so," he said, his voice filled with a quiet authority. "Before God and this congregation, let no one speak against what this man has claimed in honor." Clara felt like her knees were about to give out. Tears were streaming down her face, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they weren't tears of shame. She lifted her chin. She felt Eli's hand tighten around hers, a solid, unbreakable anchor in a storm of judgment. The whispers had died. The judgment had been silenced. In one single, defiant act, Eli had not just saved her dignity. He had given it back to her. That night, the air in the cabin felt different. It was lighter. Clara stood on the porch, watching the last streaks of purple and gold fade from the sky. The twins were asleep inside, their bellies full, their breathing even and deep. Eli came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence was a promise. She no longer felt like a burden he was forced to carry. She felt chosen. But just as a fragile peace began to settle over them, a new shadow fell. After the crowd had dispersed that Sunday, Sheriff Pike had pulled Eli aside, his face grim. "That was a brave thing you did, McGraw," he'd said, his voice barely a whisper. "But you need to be careful. That woman? When you carried her into town, I saw something on her wrist. A brand. The mark of the Black Creek Mining Company." Eli had frowned, confused. "What's that mean?" The sheriff had glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "It means she ain't a widow, Eli. She's property. And those men, they don't take kindly to people stealing what's theirs." The peace was a lie. The battle wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The sheriff's warning hung in the air between them, a poison that tainted the fragile peace they had built. A brand. The words echoed in Eli's mind. He had seen it, of course, a small, dark symbol on the inside of her wrist, but he'd assumed it was a scar, an old injury. He had never imagined it was a mark of ownership. He looked at Clara differently now. He saw the way her eyes would dart towards the road, the way she would flinch at the sound of a horse riding past too quickly. Her fear wasn't just about the town's gossip. It was something older, deeper. She wasn't just running from poverty, she was running from someone. He didn't ask her about it, prying wasn't his way. If she wanted to tell him, she would. But the silence in the cabin was no longer comfortable. It was thick with unspoken questions. The empty rocking chair in the corner seemed to mock him, a reminder of the life he'd lost and the dangerous new one he'd stumbled into. One afternoon, he was chopping wood behind the cabin when he saw the twins playing near the creek. They were laughing, chasing dragonflies, their patched dresses bright against the green grass. Clara was watching them from the porch, and for a moment, a real, genuine smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, erasing the lines of worry and fear. She looked young, she looked beautiful, and in that moment, Eli knew. It didn't matter what brand was on her wrist. It didn't matter who was coming for her. She was his wife. The girls were his daughters. That was the vow he had made, not just to the town, but to himself. He would protect them, no matter the cost. The cost arrived 2 weeks later. It came in the form of a man on a big black horse. He was dressed in clothes that were too fine for this dusty part of the country. A tailored coat, polished boots, and a silver-buckled gun belt. He rode into town like he owned it, his eyes scanning every building, every face, with a cold, dismissive arrogance. He went straight to the saloon. Men who had been quick to judge Eli and Clara suddenly found their boots very interesting. They nursed their whiskeys and avoided the stranger's gaze. But Martha Green, her curiosity outweighing her sense of self-preservation, sidled up to the bar. "Looking for someone, mister?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet. The stranger turned slowly. His eyes were pale blue and as cold as a winter river. "A woman," he said, his voice a low growl. "And 2 little girls. She's got dark hair and she's skinny as a stray dog. Answers to the name Clara." He tossed a gold coin onto the bar. "Information will be rewarded." Martha's eyes widened. Gold. She looked at the coin, then back at the stranger's hard face. The town's petty gossip was one thing. This was something else entirely. This man wasn't here to pass judgment. He was here to collect. The news traveled through town faster than a prairie fire. Sheriff Pike heard it and felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He sent a boy running out to Eli's cabin. "Tell him a stranger is in town. Tell him Jedediah is here." When the boy arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, Eli was fixing a fence post. He heard the name Jedediah and saw Clara, who was hanging laundry on the line, drop her basket. The color drained from her face. Her eyes, fixed on the road leading to town, were filled with a terror so profound it made Eli's blood run cold. She didn't have to say a word. He knew. This was the man she was running from, the owner of the brand. "Get the girls inside," Eli said, his voice calm, but his hand went to the axe he was holding. He didn't take his eyes off the road. "Lock the door, and don't open it for anyone but me." Clara just nodded, her face a mask of fear. She scooped up the twins and ran into the cabin, the slam of the door echoing in the quiet afternoon. Eli stood there for a long time, the axe feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He wasn't a gunman. He was a farmer, a widower who had wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his grief. But that life was over. The storm he had been waiting for had finally arrived. He walked to the cabin and pulled his father's old rifle from its place above the mantel. He checked the load. It was an old gun, but it was reliable. He sat in the rocking chair, his wife's chair, and placed the rifle across his lap. He looked at the locked door, at the terrified woman and children hiding inside. He wasn't just protecting a stray he'd taken in, he was defending his family. He was defending his home. And Jedediah would have to come through him to get to them. The sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the yard. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. The waiting was a torture, a slow tightening of a knot in his chest. Then he heard it. The steady, unmistakable sound of a horse approaching. Eli's knuckles turned white on the stock of the rifle. He stood up and moved to the window, peering out through a crack in the curtains. The man on the black horse was riding slowly, deliberately, up the path to his cabin. It was Jedediah. He stopped about 30 yards from the porch and just sat there, his cold eyes taking in the small cabin, the neatly chopped wood, the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. He looked like a wolf sizing up a sheep pen. Then he dismounted. He didn't draw his gun. He just started walking towards the front door, his polished boots making soft thuds in the dirt. He walked with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. Eli's heart was pounding against his ribs. He could hear Clara whispering frantic prayers from the other room, the twins crying softly. He took a deep breath, steadied his hands, and raised the rifle. He centered the sight on Jedediah's chest. Jedediah stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked right at the door, as if he could see Eli standing there. "Clara," he called out, his voice smooth and deceptively calm. "I know you're in there, my dear. I've come a long way to bring you home. Don't make this unpleasant." The silence from inside the cabin was his only answer. A flicker of annoyance crossed Jedediah's face. "I am a patient man," he continued, "but my patience has its limits. This foolishness ends now. Send out my property." He wasn't talking to Clara anymore. He was talking to Eli. Eli's finger tightened on the trigger. His mind was racing. If he shot this man, he'd be a killer. The law would come for him, but if he didn't, what would Jedediah do to Clara? To the girls? The brand on her wrist was a testament to his cruelty. "She's not your property." Eli's voice was a low growl, muffled by the door. "She's my wife." A cold, humorless smile spread across Jedediah's lips. "Wife?" He chuckled. "You think a few words spoken in a dusty churchyard can erase a contract? She belongs to me. The Black Creek Mining Company bought and paid for her. Her and any children she produces. They are assets, and I've come to collect my assets." The truth hit Eli with the force of a physical blow. Clara wasn't an indentured servant. She was a slave, in everything but name. The law, the real law from the East, would be on Jedediah's side. He had a contract. All Eli had was a vow. "You're not taking them," Eli said, his voice flat and final. "I see," Jedediah said softly. He took a step back. "You've chosen the hard way." He turned and walked back to his horse. For a heart-stopping moment, Eli thought he was leaving, but then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a torch and a can of kerosene. "A man's home is his castle," Jedediah called out, his voice laced with mock sympathy. "But even castles burn." He started to splash the kerosene on the dry wooden porch steps. Eli's blood ran cold. This man wouldn't just kill him. He would burn them all alive. He would burn the cabin to the ground with Clara and the girls inside, just to make a point. There was no choice left. Eli flung the door open and stepped out onto the porch, the rifle leveled at Jedediah's heart. "Get away from my house," he said, his voice shaking with a rage he hadn't felt in years. Jedediah just smiled, the torchlight dancing in his cold eyes. He held up the lit torch. "This is your last chance, farmer. Send her out, and I'll let you live." Behind Eli, the cabin door creaked open. Clara stood there, her face pale as a ghost, the two girls clinging to her skirt. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Don't hurt him. I'll go." "Get back inside, Clara," Eli ordered, never taking his eyes off Jedediah. "I won't let you die for me," she sobbed, taking a step onto the porch. Jedediah's smile widened. He had won. "That's a good girl," he purred. But as Clara took another step, something happened. From the road, another sound emerged, the thundering of hoofbeats, a lot of them. Jedediah's head snapped around, his confident smirk vanishing. Riding hard out of the twilight was Sheriff Pike, and behind him, on horseback and on foot, were at least a dozen men from the town. They were carrying rifles, shotguns, even pitchforks. They formed a silent, determined line between Jedediah and the cabin. Sheriff Pike reined in his horse, his face set like granite. "That's far enough, Jedediah," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the law. Jedediah stared at the armed townsfolk, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What is this, Pike? These are my assets. I have the paperwork. The law is on my side." "Maybe so," the sheriff replied, pulling his own pistol. "But you're in my town now, and we have our own laws. And our first law is we don't let monsters burn women and children alive." For the first time, a flicker of fear appeared in Jedediah's cold eyes. He was one man against a whole town. He looked at Eli's steady rifle, at the sheriff's pistol, at the grim-faced farmers arrayed against him. He was beaten. He snarled, a low, animal sound of pure hatred. He threw the torch into the dirt, where it sputtered and died. "This isn't over, farmer," he spat at Eli. "The company will hear about this. They'll send men. They'll burn this whole pathetic town to the ground." "Get out," the sheriff said simply, "and don't ever come back." Jedediah climbed back onto his horse, his face contorted with rage. He gave Clara one last venomous look, a look that promised a future of pain and vengeance. Then he wheeled his horse around and galloped off into the darkness, swallowed by the night. A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. Men lowered their rifles. Someone clapped Eli on the shoulder. Clara collapsed onto the porch steps, sobbing with relief. The twins, seeing that the danger was past, ran to Eli and wrapped their arms around his legs, burying their faces in his trousers. He looked out at the faces of the men from town. These were the same men who had whispered about him, the same men who had judged him. But when it mattered, when a real evil had come to their town, they had stood with him. He saw Martha Green standing at the back of the crowd, her face pale, her usual sneer replaced by a look of shame. He had misjudged them, and they had misjudged him. He knelt and put his arms around the girls, pulling them into a fierce hug. Clara came and put her hand on his shoulder. Her touch was no longer hesitant or filled with shame. It was firm, grateful, and full of a love that had been forged in fear and fire. The threat of Jedediah was gone for now, but his parting words were a promise. The company, they would be back. This small, forgotten town had just declared war on a powerful, ruthless entity. Eli looked up at the stars, the two little girls still clinging to him. He was no longer just a widower living out his days in quiet grief. He was a husband, a father, and a protector. The fight for his family was over, but the fight for his town had just begun. And as he looked at Clara's face, illuminated by the moonlight, he knew he wouldn't be fighting alone. They had faced down the town's judgment, and they had faced down a monster. Whatever came next, they would face it together. If you were on the edge of your seat through Eli's story, and you believe in the power of a community to stand up against evil, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss our next story. You never know what darkness is hiding just beyond the firelight.